and welcome to our third installment of Let's Learn About Egypt. On today's episode, we're going to look at the religion of Judaism during the time of ancient Egypt. If there is one thing that affects history the most, it's either location or religion. Judaism is one of the world's oldest living and oldest surviving religions that can be traced back to the roots of the the New Kingdom of ancient Egypt. Now, with all our lectures that we've been doing, make sure, as you should know by now, to have your Lecture 3 worksheet out and are filling it in as we go over the notes. And we also have our special presentation. So here you go.
Listen up, you animals. It's time to turn off your cell phones. That means no talking. Hola. No texting.
What?
No tweeting. And no jibber-jabbering. Comprende? No questions.
Alright, so now that we got all that stuff out of the way, let's get to learning, shall we? So, our topics for today, we're going to look at, obviously, our setting the stage, where we're starting out in this particular lecture as far as the Jews, or what they used to be called before that, the Hebrews. We'll be looking at the search for the Promised Land and God's promise to the Hebrews of the land of milk and honey. We'll then move on to Moses and the Exodus, the freeing of the Egyptians under Egyptian rule of the Pharaoh. We'll move on to the Kingdom of Israel and some of the problems that they were having. And finally, we'll talk about the Babylonian Captivity and how the Jews were able to survive that time period in their history. So, we have 5 terms that we will be using throughout this particular lecture. There'll be more than that, but these 5 I want you to pay particularly attention to. First, we have Hebrews, which is the original name for Jews. We have a covenant, which is simply another word for promise. The Torah, which is a special book or a part of Jewish beliefs. Israel, which is it's present-day Israel, basically, where the Jews call home. And Exodus, which is the time period of the Jews leaving Egypt under the direction of Moses. Now, let's get to our notes. So, setting the stage for this lecture, let's take a look at who are the Jews and where exactly did they come from. So, Canaan was the ancient home of the Hebrews, who would later be called the Jews. Canaan is what we call Israel today. The Hebrews, according to their legends and histories and moral codes, have had a major influence on Western culture. Even today, Judaism is found all throughout the world. So they have had to have brought some significance of their religion or some importance of their religion with them as they moved around the world. So there's certainly an important aspect or important religion around the world even today. Additionally, part of the Hebrew religion is shared with other major religions, including Christianity, Islam, which are 2 of the other large religions throughout the world today. Both of those religions can actually find their foundations in the Jewish beliefs, which we'll talk about later on as well as in future lectures. So, here we have a map that identifies the location of ancient Canaan, which is also known as Palestine. Depending on who you are, this is the homeland for both Jews and the Palestinians. Today, this land is known as Israel. Since both groups can trace their religious origins to this strip of land, both groups hold it very sacred. Even today, there are daily reports of attacks happening between the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority, both trying to hold on to what land they have in this region. It's always been a problem for thousands of years, and it continues to be a problem between these 2 different groups of Jews and the Palestinians who practice mostly the religion of Islam. So, the search for the Promised Land. The Promised Land, yes. Because of its strategic location between Africa and Asia and Europe, ancient Palestine was the crossroad to the ancient world. If you wanted to do trade from Egypt to areas of the north, to the Mediterranean, and all around Europe, you needed to kind of go through Palestine first. So it was a very important strategic location in the region. Palestine, as you saw in the previous slide, is the region at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. The Hebrews eventually settled in Canaan, which was located in Palestine. This obviously might have caused some problems for those who already lived there. The Bible speaks of a battle between the Hebrews and the inhabitants of the city, where in the end the Hebrews would eventually win and be allowed to settle there. According to the Bible, this was God's promised land and promise to the Hebrews. The historical accounts of the Hebrews is well documented in the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Christian Bible, and also the first 5 books of the Jewish Tanakh, which is the holy book for the Jews. Torah means instruction, according to Hebrew translation, and it includes the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy in the Christian Bible, and as I mentioned, in the Tanakh. Christians and Hebrews traditionally believed that God had dictated the book to Moses, who in turn wrote it down. Today, though, most scholars believe that the 5 books were written probably by multiple authors over a period of several centuries. Moving on. Most of what we know about early Hebrew history is found in those first 5 books, the Tanakh, in the Tanakh, which, as I mentioned, is the Torah. So the Torah is the first 5 books, and the Tanakh is the Jewish holy book. The Torah is the most sacred writing to the Hebrews and makes a part of the Old Testament for Christians today. In the book of Genesis, God chose a guy by the name of Abraham to become the father of the Hebrew people. And from there is where we have the beginning of early Hebrew or Jewish religion. Abraham was a shepherd who lived in the region known as in Mesopotamia. We've kind of talked about this before. Sometime along his lifetime, God had commanded him to move his people, basically his family, to Canaan around the year 1800 BCE. Eventually, though, the descendants of Abraham would move to Egypt around 1650 BCE. These Hebrews were monotheistic, which means that they worshipped in only one God. And this God they called Yahweh. As the story goes, God created a covenant, which is just a fancy word for promise, with Abraham that said that if his people obeyed the laws of Yahweh, that he would protect them, and Abraham would have basically an uncountable number of descendants. Okay, so if Abraham and his family followed the rules that God put forth, he would be the beginning, the foundation of a new nation, or in this case, a new religion. Here we see an artist's idea of Abraham asking for guidance from Yahweh. And if you look kind of back in the tent, you can see his wife Sarah looking out from the tent. As you can see, this picture depicts both Abraham and Sarah as pretty old people. It's my belief that this picture is specifically looking at Abraham praying to God for guidance in response to him not having a son yet. How is he supposed to be able to create this new nation, this new religion, when he doesn't even have a son, or a girl for that matter? So he's probably asking for guidance and trying to figure out what the heck he's supposed to do with this promise that he, in his mind, can't fulfill since he doesn't have a child yet. So We'll see with that. Eventually, Abraham does have his kid. We talked about that last unit with his son, with his two kids through Sarah and Hagar and all that stuff. We talked about that before. But what we are going to talk about, though, is where exactly and how exactly the Jews got into Egypt. So, where exactly did the Jews come from, you might ask? Well, more importantly, it's still important that we understand this question, because in order to understand Jewish history, we need to understand their culture and how they got there, and some of the problems that existed throughout their ancient time periods, particularly in this case in Egypt. So, the Bible says that the Hebrews migrated to Egypt because of drought and famine. They had to leave Ur, up in Mesopotamia, go a little south, where the Nile was, and they could prosper better. Remember, the Nile was a predictable river. They were hoping that they were able to be more successful. And fortunately, at the time, they were accepted by the Egyptians that had been there. However, as they stayed longer and as they produced more kids, the people of Egypt were starting to regret the fact that they allowed these Hebrews into their territory. And unfortunately, they were later forced to become slaves. However, after hundreds of years of slavery and all these problems with the Egyptian pharaohs, some guy would come along and free them from all this bad stuff going on. And his name was Moses. So let's talk about this guy. Moses would become the savior of the Hebrews. Let's look at some of these stories relating to Moses. At the time of Moses' birth, the Pharaoh felt threatened by the Hebrews and commanded that all firstborn males to be killed. All newborn males to be killed. The Pharaoh saw the increase in the Hebrew population as a problem, and he was worried that if they increased their numbers, these male Hebrews could possibly overthrow his government. So he tried to put a stopper on that by killing all the males as fast as he could that were newborns. In an attempt to save her daughter, a young Hebrew woman took her own son to the shores of the Nile and laid him among the reeds in the Nile inside of a basket in hopings of saving him, according to the Bible. As the story goes, an Egyptian princess had found the baby that was laying there. And because she took pity on him, probably because he was just a cute little baby, no parents around, she took pity on him and decided to save him. And she would take the child, not as her own, but she would make sure that the child is taken care of. So, she took him to the palace to be raised. Basically, almost a prince. Okay? Pretty lucky. I mean, here's this guy, born a Hebrew, supposed to be dead. They're supposed to be killed, basically, thrown into the Nile to drown. But instead, he is saved by the daughter of the Pharaoh who said to kill him. It's funny how things work. And here we see this lucky lad being rescued by this Egyptian princess. Although Moses was raised in the within the royal household, he did not forget his history and that he was Hebrew. No one, not even the Pharaoh, whom likely was a childhood friend of his, probably somebody that he played with, knew that Moses was Hebrew. Except for one person, and that was the nanny. Okay? Moses knew he was Hebrew because he was raised as Hebrew from the nanny. When the princess found Moses in the water, she immediately called for a wet nurse. That a wet nurse is simply just a woman who has recently had a child who could still breastfeed. And the princess called for this wet nurse, this Hebrew wet nurse, to come in and care for Moses and take care of him. What the princess probably didn't know is that the wet nurse was actually Moses' real mother. So as it turned out, Moses was raised by his real mother when nobody else probably knew that. I'm sure she knew, and Moses would find out eventually. But nobody knew that this was actually his real mother. So he was raised in the ways and the traditions of the Hebrews. However, the truth would eventually come out. And he would eventually try to, I don't want to say overthrow, but try and protect some Hebrews that were being mistreated one day when he was walking among them. He would become a slave. He would be kicked out of the royal house and eventually become a slave. He couldn't be protected anymore once it was found out he was Hebrew. As a slave, he eventually would come in contact with God's presence. We won't get into that whole story. But in the end, as the story goes, long story short, God commanded Moses to help the Hebrews to get out of Egypt. And when God asks you to do something, you kind of do it. That's just kind of how it goes. So, this became known as the Exodus, the whole "let my people go" thing, with all these different famines and stuff that would eventually happen to the Egypt. This mass exiting of Hebrews from Egypt would become troublesome at the time of this Exodus, as well as the future for these Hebrews that are trying to get away. While attempting to flee Egypt, the Bible describes how Moses was able to guide the Hebrews out of Egypt, at one point even, according to the Bible, being able to split the Red Sea in half so that the people could cross through it and get to the other side unharmed, all while being chased by the Egyptian army when the Pharaoh decided to change his mind and try and get the Hebrews back. Well, that didn't work out too well for him. After crossing the Red Sea, Moses would lead the Hebrews across the Sinai Peninsula, which is kind of present-day Saudi Arabia, and eventually to the base of Mount Sinai. There he went up to the mountain alone to pray. Once there, Moses spoke to God and was given what we know today as the 10 Commandments that were carved on 2 tablets. These 10 Commandments and other teachings would become the basis of religious law for Judaism and Christianity. And here's kind of a simple English translation of these 10 Commandments. If you feel like pausing to take a break or to read these, feel free. But traditionally, they're actually believed that one tablet had the first 3 laws, and then the other tablet had the remaining 7 laws. But just for simplicity's sake, they just kind of split it 5 and 5, I guess. So, if you want to pause it, take a look, feel free. You probably know a bunch of these already. The story of Moses and the Exodus has become so popular that it's even become a piece in Hollywood. As some of you might have seen the movie The Prince of Egypt, an animated story about Egypt getting the people out. Way back a long time ago, I want to say like the 1950s, 1960s, they even made a big blockbuster movie called The 10 Commandments that described the whole story of Moses and the Pharaoh and getting out of Egypt and into the Sinai Peninsula and the 10 Commandments and eventually meeting back up in Israel. So, continuing with the story. The Kingdom of Israel. After 40 years of wandering in the Sinai Peninsula and all around the Middle East area, eventually they would come back to Canaan. Canaan was harsh, with desert, rocky wilderness, and a hot valley by the Jordan River. This, again, was supposedly the land promised to the Hebrews by God. Of the 12 tribes of the Hebrews, or the 12 families that had left Egypt with Moses, only the tribe of Judah was left. Soon they would become known as the Jews, and the religion would be known as Judaism. named after that tribe of Judah. This tribe would unite under one kingdom known as Israel. It wasn't until actually recent history, in 1948, that the country of Israel was officially recognized throughout the world as a legitimate, independent country, even though that the Jews had always been claiming this land as theirs because God had always promised it to them. One of the more powerful Hebrew kings, going back in history again, was Solomon, who successfully built a trading empire. He glorified the city of Jerusalem by building important temples in Jerusalem. One particularly was known as Solomon's Temple. As time goes on, the kingdom unfortunately would divide into two parts, different ways of different groups within the Jewish faith that believed in different aspects of ruling over one another. So they would split up. One group or one area would become known as Israel, which would be in the north, and Judah, which would be in the south. The people that lived there were all Jews, but again, they split up their one country of Israel into two parts to create two separate countries. And again, this is way back in history, not recent history. Here we kind of see in the red outline the borders of present-day Israel, which is the black outline. The red outline is the present day of Israel. And if you look at and trace the black lines, that kind of shows you the difference between the Israel and Judea way back in the day. Based upon the Bible's description, and looking at the time period of Solomon, we can kind of get an idea of what his temple might have looked like. Solomon's temple is believed to have been built somewhere around 832 BCE and is believed to have stood for over 400 years until its destruction around 422 BC. Originally dedicated to Yahweh, which is the Hebrew's name for God, it is believed to have housed at one time the Ark of the Covenant, which is the box that held the Ten Commandments. And eventually those commandments got lost somehow. But again, this temple is supposedly to be the place where those 10 commandments had been stored for a time. What happened to those 10 commandments and the Ark of the Covenant? No one knows. But if you watch Indiana Jones, he has some ideas because they made a movie about that. Raiders of the Lost Ark. Good movie. In our last topic, the Babylonian Captivity. Eventually, disaster would strike both Israel and Judah, and both were forced to start paying a tribute to the Assyrians, outside invaders. A tribute is peace money paid by the weaker to a stronger power. So the idea was the Assyrians would leave the Israelites alone and the Judeans alone if they kept paying almost like a tax. But it was basically a bribe. We won't attack you if you just keep paying us. As it happened, no matter how much tribute that these people would pay, it was never going to be enough. And eventually the Assyrians invaded in 725 BCE, taking part of Samaria, which is part of Israel. Was the capital of Israel at the time. By 722 BC, the whole northern kingdom was under the Assyrian control. The southern kingdom lasted for about another 150 years before falling to the Babylonians. The Assyrians had been losing control to the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. The temple that had been built by Solomon would be destroyed by the Babylonians. However, in 549 BC, the Persian king Cyrus the Great, who was nice, took pity and allowed the Hebrews who were exiled to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. So again, Cyrus the Great was after Nebuchadnezzar. He took the Israelites into slavery, but eventually Cyrus came back and allowed the people, the Jews or the Hebrews, to go back home to Jerusalem and rebuild Solomon's temple. Throughout history, many others would dominate the region of Israel, including the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. Today, though, Jerusalem is a very important city for the Jews, Christians, and Muslims, all because of the religious history that occurred there for each of their own religions. Today we see Jerusalem as a busy city of modern life built around the ancient walls that were once there used to protect it. It is still a stronghold for these different religions, and it's a major tourist attraction for all three, despite the fact that there is a lot of social unrest among these different religions. On the left there, you kind of see that big dome, which is actually very important to both Muslims and Jews. Both of them have significant presence there. Supposedly that temple is built on top of Solomon's temple, or his temple. However, this temple was built by the Muslims. So it's important for the Jews, because Solomon's temple is buried there, but it's also important to the Muslims because their temple is there. Fortunately, there's an agreement between the two religions, or the two groups, that one place, as long as everybody is peaceful, everybody will leave everybody alone. Okay, the Jews can practice their going to this location, this religious landmark, as part of their religion, and the Muslims are allowed to do the same thing as long as everybody is peaceful about it. Otherwise, they have problems, treaties are broke, and then they got to figure all this stuff out again so they can remain peaceful and stop all the fighting. It gets complicated, but there you have it. So, as a result, the history of the Hebrews has been a long and arduous journey. Of the 5 major religions that we will study in this class, this is probably one of the oldest and also one of the most influential throughout history. Many of their practices and ideas would cross into many mainstream cultures today, again including Christianity, Islam, and obviously Judaism, which this whole lecture was about. So, there you have it, the final lecture of our Unit 2. Hope you enjoyed it. Please remember that if you have any questions relating to this lecture, or any other questions, please let me know and I'd be more than happy to help you. Don't hesitate to review these lectures to assist you in preparing for your upcoming test, which will probably be in the next few days. Our next unit will be focusing on the religions of Hinduism and Buddhism, and how people in India got there and started their culture and their traditions. So, with that, I'll bid you adieu and enjoy the rest of your day.